Hello, everybody. I am Dr. Nicola Knight. I am the coordinator for the Physical Sciences Data Infrastructure Project, and I'm here to facilitate this webinar today. Today, we are joined by Dr. Loic Lanelong, who is a researcher at the University of Cambridge, and he's focusing on environmentally sustainable computing. So we're going to hear hopefully all about green algorithms, green DiSC, and greener principles, a really exciting topic today. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Loic.
Great, thank you so much. Very happy to be here. I should maybe say first that although I'm talking about sustainability today, my background is mostly kind of applied math and statistics and machine learning and computational biology. So I'm not here at all to say we shouldn't do compute and we shouldn't do simulations anymore. I completely see and understand the value of it, but rather that we need to be mindful of other impacts of it. And so this first slide here, again, completely acknowledging like the amazing discoveries that came out of high performance computing, completely cherry picked some examples. Where it gets interesting as well is a lot of applications in fighting climate change. So, making energy grids more efficient, better understanding climate events and so on. So that's the good side of that. But it's also important to understand the cost of this. So it's quite hard to quantify the carbon footprint of scientists. As you can imagine, it depends so much on the field of research being tackled. But estimates for scientists, they range from like 4 to 40 tons of CO2 equivalent per year per person. Now, for context, the IPCC target for sustainability is 2 tons per year per person. That's kind of the theoretical budget. More concretely, here we are. It's quite interesting. EMBOLS, that's the European Molecular Biology Lab. So they have lots of centers across Europe, and they do both compute and wet lab research. And they've done some statistics. So they found that it was around 65 tons of CO2 per publication, and around 29 tons per full-time staff. So very much, in the range I mentioned just before, and that's especially compared to the 2-ton limit, that's quite a big number. That's not only compute though. So if we focus more broadly on the digital sector, so like the ICT sector, information and communication technology, globally, they tend to be between 2 and 3% of global greenhouse gas emission. And this chart shows like different publications forecast for the coming years. They can't agree on many things, but they agree on the fact that it's going up. And for context, the aviation sector, we're talking 1.9%. Data centers in particular, that's a subcategory of it. Latest estimates talk about 126 megatons of CO2 equivalent per year. That's the same as the American commercial aviation. So that's quite a large number. Now, that's a lot of numbers, but that's just to provide some context and hopefully show that, that's something we should be slightly mindful of. And sorry for my voice, I'm just coming out of a bad cold. So some of you may be familiar with XSEED, which is this network of institutional data centers. So basically, it's now concluded, but it was a network of universities putting the data centers together. So, when Florida goes to sleep, California can start working on the computers or something. What's interesting is they have statistics. So for example, in 2020, 9 billion compute hours were used on the servers, which is just mind-blowing. That's 24 million hours every day. Quite mind-blowing in terms of usage. And interestingly, they've got this pie chart showing by fields of research, and that really showed that this is quite well spread out between different fields. There's not just one field taking all the compute. So that really shows it's relevant to hopefully everyone here. Now, if we look at individual analysis, sorry about that. If we look at individual analysis, I took some examples of biology because that's what I'm more familiar with, and it doesn't really matter if you're not familiar with this particular application. The first one, GWAS, it's every time you read an article that says we found the gene for X, that's what happened. And a metagenome assembly, you take a soil sample and you try to figure out all the organisms in it, and RNA read alignments to basically do genome sequencing or RNA sequencing. The goal of this page here, this slide here, is to show that not all applications and not all analysis have enormous carbon footprint. We go from 17 tons for an individual project. So again, if we compare it to the 2 ton, that's quite a lot. to kilograms or even grams. That means we don't need to get completely paranoid about everything we're doing. That's not the point of that really, but the fact that some of these analyses have very large carbon footprint means that we need to be mindful of that in general, right? So we know that sometimes it doesn't matter because that's not the priority and that's a very small impact. But when we tackle these high impact analysis, we make sure we do it in the best way possible or not at all if actually that's not necessary. AI is all the rage these days. There was this paper a couple of years ago, really interesting, looking at large language models. So for example, the first line here, GPT-3, that's the latest ancestor of ChatGPT before they kind of made it not open. And they found that for this older version, so GPT-3, the carbon footprint of training the model just once was 550 tons. Again, if we compare that to the 2 ton per person, or that's a very large number. And this paper was showing that the different architecture that can achieve interesting results for a smaller impact. So that's the conclusion of that, is that there is a cost to computing. Now, your vision on computing costs really depends on your field, really depends on where you are, how well funded your institution is, or what kind of compute. So if you use cloud computing, then you're like, of course, there's a cost. It's quite expensive to run things on the cloud, and that's fair. If you use institutional data center in a reasonably well-funded university, then suddenly it's not quite so clear because the cost is very low. The cost per compute hour is very low. And that's the problem with something that feels like it's kind of free. It's what enables research. So again, not saying, we should overcharge scientists for compute time, but at the same time, it becomes tempting to waste it. And that's some of the issue here. And especially if in science more broadly, we kind of try to improve society in one way or another. I'm based in the cardiovascular epidemiology unit, which means a lot of the diseases the unit treats or researches is climate related, air pollution and so on. And so obviously that's a bit of an issue of how do we combine trying to alleviate the burden of disease, but also contributing to it through our research. More broadly, and I'm not going to focus a lot on that, but more broadly, research impacts the environment in many ways through conference travels, for example. Then there's everything that's like wet lab or like, experimental work. Then there's computing and just general office impact. And obviously, we're going to focus on computing today. And in particular, we're going to focus on intense computation. So I'm not going to talk too much about, Zoom or emails or things like that, but very much like computing that requires a lot of resources. And in the past 2 or 3 years, it's been really good to see more and more work in this space. So more and more people looking at the environmental impact of their own field of research, but not only people working on sustainability, but we have examples here in in physics, in astrophysics, neuroscience, computational social sciences, geography. It's really interesting, and that's a very, very outdated slide. Really, there's been so much work in the past year or so. So let's try to understand these environmental impacts. There are lots of ways to look at them. So for example, we can look at embodied versus use stage. Use stage impact is, well, the environmental impact from using the device. That's quite straightforward. Embodied is everything else. So that's manufacturing, distribution, sales, and then end-of-life treatment. If we look at laptops, tablets, phones, between 70 and 93% of this total footprint is only from manufacturing, which is very low. Your phone is upward of 90% manufacturing, which means that for these devices, it doesn't really matter, how we charge them or whatever. What really makes a difference is not replacing them every year and keeping them for as long as we can. The manufacturing share for servers and data centers is lower, not because they're cleaner to manufacture, but just because they're used so much more. And that's something that is really, as you can imagine, really hard to quantify because, it depends on so many actors. There's the whole supply chain to include. So we tend to kind of ignore it and only look at use stage, but it's really critical to account for embodied impacts as well. If we look at the other end of the spectrum, so we focus on use stage, there's this depressing report from the World Health Organization that reports on electronic waste or e-waste. And they report that over 80% of the 54 million tons of electronic waste are handled by what they call informal waste workers, up to 50 million of them, which is basically people working on dump sites. Children are a big part of the waste processing industry. And the problem with electronic waste is we don't foresee them to decrease anytime soon. So that's why, we have to look at the big picture. Another way to look at this problem is, of course, to focus on carbon footprint. And actually, that's what I've been doing so far. All the numbers I gave you, they all in tons of CO2 equivalent or something like that. And that's great. That's greenhouse gas emission. That's really important. But this is not the only environmental impact to consider. We looked at dump sites earlier. A lot of the problems there are not greenhouse gas emission. One example is water usage for data centers. So there's this kind of short article reporting that a medium-sized data center uses as much water as 3 average-sized hospitals. Now, I have no idea how much an average-sized hospital, how much water it uses. I'm pretty much sure that shouldn't be the metric of comparison for a data center. And not all of them are like that, but that's a bit of an issue. More broadly, we can look at this plot here. It's quite messy, so maybe just focus on the left-hand side here, and the fact that each category here is a standardized category for life cycle assessments. So climate change in the middle is the only one that is actually directly related to greenhouse gas emissions. So when we talk about carbon footprint, that's the climate change category, and that's really important. But a lot of these other ones, things like water use or freshwater ecotoxicity, or land use, or something particularly relevant to the digital sector, which is the last one at the bottom, which is abiotic resources usage, in particular minerals and metals. So you can see all these categories, and what the plot tries to do here, but I'm not going to get into that, is to map these categories to the planetary boundaries, and so that's not kind of a straightforward one-to-one mapping. So that's why the plot's a bit messy. But it's really interesting too, like that there are so many aspects we actually need to be thinking about beyond just greenhouse gas emissions. And the last way to look at it is computing versus storage. So of course, we tend to think about electricity usage for computing to run the servers, but actually, in some fields, in particular, data storage is the main issue. Or if you, for example, generate a lot of data but don't analyze them yourself, that's a problem, because storage tends to go on for years and years and years. If we look at an average data center, the energy bill, only half the electricity that's provided to the building will actually end up in the servers. Then you'll have about 10% for storage, and the remaining 40% will be for overheads, so mostly cooling. And so this 10%, it's not enormous, and it varies greatly between data centers and the kind of task they're tackling, but that's not completely negligible either. Very rough number, and that's only an order of magnitude, but you can remember as a rule of thumb, it's around 10 kilograms of CO2 equivalent to store 1 terabyte of data for a year. Now, depending on the kind of data you're working with, you'll think it's either enormous or very small. If you only store maybe 1 terabyte or a few gigabytes, then sure, that's not that much. If you are on a large scale project that generates maybe petabytes of data, so thousands of terabytes, that is a little bit more of a problem. And this problem in particular in research, that we are terrible at deleting data. Now, it's a good thing, we want to keep data, but we probably don't need to keep everything that we're currently keeping. Okay, let's go back to this computation part, because that's probably what you're expecting more from that. If we try to understand the carbon footprint of running a compute, or actually any activity, but in this case, compute, it's quite easy on paper. We need to figure out how much energy we need, and that just depends on the hardware and the software. And then we need to figure out what the carbon footprint of producing that much electricity is. And that's generally called carbon intensity. And that mostly depends on where you are in the world, because most data centers are just plugged into the main power grid. So there's this website called Electricity Map that provides absolutely brilliant resources on carbon footprint of carbon intensity for electricity. That's really good. You can zoom in and see import, export between countries, follow in real time. It's really interesting. But you can see that there's a great variation between countries, and you can very easily reach a factor, 100 and more between different locations, which obviously for the same task is a bit of of an impact. So let's take a couple of examples. Let's say you decide to relocate your compute, same hardware, same software, same everything, from Sweden to Poland. What happens? You multiply your carbon footprint by 46, just based on source of electricity. Now that's a bit extreme, moving between countries. Let's just look at different locations in the same country. So we are on the northwest coast of the US in Washington State. You just change county, change electricity provider, stay in the same state, already multiplying by 9 just because of the share of renewable in these two electricity network. Now, always have this like kind of reminder here. It doesn't mean we should stop doing science. There are actually a lot of good scientific practice, doing better science, open data, and so on, reproducibility, that actually go hand in hand with sustainability. So, it's not all doom and gloom. And so as part of trying to tackle all that, we started over 5 years ago now, well, about exactly 5 years ago, this Green Algorithms initiative, where we try to do a lot of stuff, but we really started from the angle of saying there's a lot of great work that has been done on sustainability in data center or by manufacturers, but scientists on the ground actually don't feel very involved in that. And most computational scientists, regardless of the field, haven't really been thinking about it. And that was 5 years ago. And so starting by really the idea of empowering computational scientists and organizations to really understand and mitigate the environmental impact of their work. So I started with tools for carbon footprint estimation. I'll talk about that in a moment, but just having more broadly some frameworks, some community building exercise, and some policy work. And I'll kind of quickly mention some of it in the rest of the talk. So one of the questions that comes up when trying to track the carbon footprint of, for example, a project or an analysis is to say, well, are we measuring or estimating it? So measuring it, you can put a watt meter on the back of your computer or server and see how much electricity is going in. And that's good, it works well, but that requires you to have access to the computer itself, which if you're using an institutional data center, you really don't have access to. So the other solution is to estimate it as a user. So purely user-based, how can you estimate the carbon footprint of your work? And actually, or at least estimate the energy usage, and then you can convert that to carbon footprint. And it turns out it works reasonably well. So looking at, I'm not going to go into the details of the formula, but using things like running time, but also very basic metrics. So you only look at the power draw from the processing cores, that's your CPU, your GPU, and the memory. And then you need to include the efficiency of the data center. So there's this metric called PUE, for power usage effectiveness. And that's quite straightforward. It's the ratio between the total power provided to the facility over the power provided to the IT equipment themselves. And that basically is a measure of overheads. The closer to 1, the better. And if you do that, we get actually reasonable estimates of energy usage. So I'm going to present our tools, but if you're interested on how to do it in practice and what are the pros and cons of each approach, a couple of years ago now, we put out this short primer. It's a very, very straightforward step-by-step guide on how to do that. But roughly, there are 3 main categories. You can use online calculators, a bit like flight calculator. What's the carbon footprint of me flying from Paris to New York? You can put packages or libraries in your code. So basically just trackers that track what you're doing while you're doing it. Or you can do it on server side. So you can, the server could be tracking what resources you're using and how much energy you're using. And the online calculator is the one that was really missing when we started working on that. So we created one. So that's the Green Algorithm Calculator. It's all online. Feel free to check it out. All the methods is in the paper, and that's quite straightforward. You go on there and you say, my model runs for that many hours using that kind of hardware, and it gives you an estimate of carbon footprint and electricity usage. And it's all completely open access on GitHub, so you can check out the data. And actually, that's very recent. That's a preview. We haven't launched it yet, but in the next couple of weeks, there'll be a new release and a new version of it, which will still have the normal works for everyone kind of approach, but there will be a second tab, which is specifically for AI, where you tend to train your model first, and then you're going to be using and making predictions, and that's two separate setups. So the calculator will evolve slightly to also accommodate for that. Now that's all great, but in practice, if you use your if you run 100 different simulations with slightly different parameters, well, that's not very good, right? To have to use the calculator. So I was thinking, could we just use the server, which already logs a lot of data to make predictions like that? So we did one that's called Green Algorithms for HPC, or GA for HPC, and that basically just use your log to estimate using exactly the same method as the calculator, but just at scale. So you can ask, what's my carbon footprint for the past 6 months? And it gives you an output like that. It's much more accurate. It's also a lot more depressing. You get things like the carbon footprint of failed jobs or over allocated memory, and that's never really nice. But there's now prettier output as well, alongside the kind of terminal output to be able to use it and have nice graphs. I don't know if any of you use pipeline managers, but if you do, you may be familiar with Nextflow, and there's now a plugin on Nextflow that basically, so an FCO2 footprint that basically does re-implement the calculator, but in a pipeline manager, so to make it easier for users to do it. And so that was all for the tool step. After a couple of years working on these tools, we thought, okay, well, can we take a step back and think about some guiding principles for the field? Where do we think we should go forward as computational scientists? And so we teamed up with funders and research organizations and research institutions and universities and people in all these organizations, and tried to come up with principles. So we came up with these greener principles, and I'll basically use that as a template for the next 20 minutes or so to go through what can we do in this space. So the first two letters are governance and responsibility, and that's just a way to say who can make a difference and who has a responsibility to make a difference. And the answer to that is a bit of everyone, actually. Grassroots movements have been incredibly powerful in sustainability initiatives to really push it up with students, undergraduates, postgraduates, lab technicians, and so on. And that's been really important, and we need to keep that. The problem of grassroots movements is at some point there's only so much difference you can make. There's only so much changes you can make in an organization, and that's where you need to also have a top-down approach, where you get university leadership, PIs, training team, and so on, that really gets on board and support that, and also industry, because a lot computing is so intertwined with industry, either through cloud providers or people who use industry, or industry which uses compute itself. So it's really important to work with industry partners. So I'm not going to go through, obviously, all the possibilities here. I'm just going to take some example. In terms of research institutions, obviously having centralized, efficient data infrastructure, encouraging researchers to embrace sustainability is a great thing. EBIs, the European Bioinformatics Institutes, and they host a lot of open source data. And well, you've probably all heard of AlphaFold, which got the Nobel Prize this year, which is for protein folding. But what I think is the real genius of AlphaFold is that they teamed up with EBI and they created AlphaFold database. So suddenly researchers didn't have to run AlphaFold themselves or anything. They could just go on there and get the predicted structure for their proteins without having to waste compute by rerunning it. And that fits more broadly onto the UK strategy for sustainability. So a few months ago, we came out this Concordat for the environmental sustainability of research and innovation. And that's supported by all the large funders in the UK, a lot of universities, a lot of scientific academies, and so on. And that's a collective recognition that yes, we need to be mindful about how we do research, and the environmental impacts of research are something to be aware of and mitigated as much as we can. From UK to Europe, there was more recently released again this Heidelberg Agreement on environmental sustainability in research funding. And that's a lot of funders, European funders, all coming together, national funders from Germany, the Netherlands, France, the UK, Ireland, Spain, Poland, probably others I've forgotten, but really coming together and saying, okay, we all agree actually that we need to do something about that fairly quickly. And that was, again, a good example of really exciting really exciting work just to get all these funders on board. In terms of funding space, something we've been pushing for years now is to say, could we have environmental impact statements? Could we ask as part of grant application that researchers, are transparent and explain why the research they proposing makes sense from an environmental perspective. And there's been quite a lot of pushback, but actually, over the past year or so, the French government decided to do it, and they basically required that for all the funding calls, the national funding calls coming out of them, which will be in the space of AI and climate, they all have to, in their application, estimate the carbon footprint of their proposed solution, and they have to do it using the online calculator, our tool I presented just before. So that was really exciting, and that's really interesting because they just decided to do it. There's actually a lot of reasons why that worked well, and a lot of things they did well. And so in the hope to try to like emulate this kind of initiative, we put together a short article with the civil servants who led that to reflect on what worked well and what could be done better. And then the final one is industry. So undoubtedly, enormous good work coming out of industry. Data center efficiency. They're really good at that. There are some examples here of Microsoft trying to see if it would make sense to put data centers underwater to limit the need for cooling. Lumi, which is a private data center, is one of the most energy efficient and most sustainable in the world. There's been an enormous amount of work. It's based in Finland. The problem is there's still some convincing to do. So one of the issues is at high level. So for example, here it's people from Google AI or Jan LeCun, who is the head of AI at Facebook. They have very serious doubt, and they for some reason decided that AI carbon footprint was not a topic that's relevant, but also decided to basically attack anyone working on that, which is a little bit disappointing. But they put out a few papers saying, "Oh, carbon footprint of AI is not something we should think about because it's basically negligible," which doesn't look so great with the very latest sustainability report that came out last summer, showing that Microsoft emissions increased by almost 30% in 3 years, 48% increase at Google between in a 3 or 4 year period. So that's enormous, considering these were companies that were on reasonably sharp decreasing trajectories. And they both acknowledge that this is because of AI and because of the deployment of AI. And so we'll have to find a way to square that in the future. The other ones are estimating and reporting, and that's quite important. I mean, I presented the online calculator as a way to estimate our carbon footprint, but then how can we be transparent about it? And so what we started to do in our group, and other people, more and more people have been starting to do it, is to basically report and acknowledge the carbon footprint of their work at the end of their publication. So then it's not taking away from the publication or anything; it's just being transparent about the downside of the research conducted, and that's really that's a really good initiative and a great way to raise awareness. So that's for estimating, that's for acknowledging impact, and that's really important. How can we take it one step further and look at reducing it? Bit old now, but a few years ago we tried to put a very high level, not technical, not guide. What are the simple things we can do? And there are things for people who build software, but there's also a lot of things for people who just use software as researchers. And most of that I've covered already, so I'm just plugging that in, but won't talk about it too much. The field of neuroscience is really interesting because it's a great example of what you can do by really taking field experts. So Charlotte Ray and Nick Sauter, they're both neuroscientists by training, working most of their time on neuroscience, but as a side project they decided to take on, can we understand the carbon footprint of some of the tools that everyone in our field uses, and could that be reduced quite easily? And so they used a tool called fMRI Prep, which is a standardized brain MRI standardization or pre-processing tool. And they found like the pie I really love, which is like the entire pie is all the data being generated by the tool on the default settings. And the green slice is what anyone will ever need as data. And the rest is virtually junk files, except for maybe 1% of the researchers. But these ones they know. And so just by not generating them by default, you could actually save a lot of energy in storage, because obviously all the data gets generated, but no one ever deletes any of it. Other opportunities for collaborations and improvements are things like location. So, I showed there was so much variability before. So it kind of makes sense on paper to say, well, maybe we could just use electricity in high renewable regions. And on paper, yes, and that's fine. But when we do that, we need to be still mindful of a lot of other, constraints and a lot of other dynamics that are not purely sustainability. So, for example, it would be a terrible thing to just go to low-income countries and tell them, don't worry, give us your data and give us your compute, but we're going to do it for you because that's better in our data centers. So that would be quite dreadful. But actually, there are ways to do that properly to make sure ownership and leadership is decentralized and not only in high income country, but done properly. That opens of course a lot of possibilities. And this idea of sustainability, we did that as a hackathon with a group of people at the Software Sustainability Institute's annual conference, and that was quite good fun. It was basically finding the best window in the next 48 hours to run a job so that it would have minimum carbon footprint using carbon intensity forecasting in the UK in particular, and that's been good fun. And the tool is actually on GitHub, so if you're interested in that, you can check it out. Couple more things. Cloud computing, the bits that work really well is the data centers tend to be efficient, and obviously you can choose location, so that jumps on the point I was just making. Lots of limitations because actually, there's a lack of transparency, so you don't really know which data center you're using. You don't necessarily know the efficiency of the data center you're using. You tend to have just headline numbers from the best ones. And also all the claims around carbon neutrality and net zero are actually based on offsetting credit, which basically doesn't work. So that's something to be aware of. Where does that take us? Education and research. Education, because it's really important to embed sustainability in the way we train computational scientists, regardless of the field. The same way that we train future doctors in ethics. But part of it for the day job, and that's fine, but part of it is for clinical research, because ethics is a big part of clinical research. And research then is because there's still a lot we don't understand about digital carbon footprint and so on. And so actually, there's a lot of scope here to make some progress as well. And why do we need all of that to lead to cultural change? It's because there's this nasty thing called rebound effect. So, classic example, you make a tool 10 times more efficient, and that's great, except the result is everyone uses it 100 times more. And so that depends what you look after, but it's great for innovation, it's great for progress. But the downside of that is if you were trying to reduce electricity usage in the first place, obviously that doesn't work anymore. You've actually increased impact. And so that's why we need to change how we think about computing, as well as relying on technological solutions. So part of this cultural change is to be able to build a community. And the idea is not to build a community between people who work on sustainable computing, but rather build a community between people who work in either field of science or research, but really just are also interested in their carbon footprint or sustainability of their work. And so that's very much the start of it. We haven't really fully launched it, but there's now an online forum where people can really go up on there and share knowledge and share data. So if you're interested in that, feel free to check it out. And I'll finish with certification schemes. So that's something that's been very successful in lots of fields, experimental work, wet lab research, that works really well. Things like EDI and so on, that works really well as well. But there was nothing for computing, and that's what motivated us to launch Green DiSC. So what is Green DiSC? It's a new certification scheme which provides basically a roadmap for research groups and institutions who wants to tackle the environmental impact of their computing. So it's something that is hosted by the Software Sustainability Institute, and that's a really exciting development that we released recently. So what do we have in mind behind it? Quite a few novelties. We decided to make it completely free and open access. So all the criteria and what you can do and the roadmap, it's all online, which doesn't happen very often. Really leverage community knowledge and try to see that there's no point for everyone to build the same induction material independently. People can share and build on their resources. And that means that it's going to have to be iterative. And, the first version is not necessarily perfect and we'll have to improve it over time. So it comes with 3 certification levels: bronze, silver, or gold. You feel free to check out the website if you're interested in this kind of stuff. All the criteria are available there. Bronze is a lot about inventory. So actually bronze is quite easy to achieve. It's about understanding what we have. What is the data we use? What is the compute we use? What is the hardware we have? How can we make sure we keep track of that? And then silver is about changing and try to improving things. There are two sets of criteria, actually, which is another specificity of it, because they are completely independent, importantly. So, as a research group, you can do it by yourself, or as a central team, something like a central sustainability team or central IT, you can also do it by yourself. But the best situation is when both work together, because this way the central team can centralize knowledge, centralize resources, and free up the time for the groups to only focus on what they can really focus on. And they can really change. And this way we don't, you don't end up having all research groups trying to find the specs of the data center, which is a bit inefficient. So if you're interested in that, that's really straightforward. It's all on the website, on the Green DiSC website on the SSI. It's all open access, so you can get started already, but otherwise you can just enroll your group and you have access to like some more detailed, kind of boring detailed logistics info, but quite practical. And once again, the community I talked about before, that's a great place to exchange knowledge on this particular scheme. And that's been really good. Like the SSI for Green DiSC has been incredibly useful. So a couple of final thoughts and then I'm done. So we'll have some time for questions. Really what we're talking about here is cost and benefit, right? And so it's this idea of not saying we shouldn't do research, far from it, or we shouldn't do compute anymore, far from it. But I quite like the way the Royal Society put it, which is to say digital technologies developed and deployed, they say in pursuit of net zero, I would actually remove that, must be energy proportionate, which means that they must bring environmental impact or societal benefits that outweigh their own simulation. So it's just this idea that we should, before starting a project, we should have a reasonable expectation that the benefits will be worth the environmental impact. And I appreciate it's always hard to quantify, but we also already do it for ethics, if you do clinical research, or you do it for funding on grants. So actually, we're familiar with this way of arguing about intangible future savings. And cost benefit is even harder when we realize that the people who will benefit the most from the latest Amazon Alexa smart speaker are not the people who will suffer the most from climate change. And so that's tough. There's no easy answer to that, but it makes the cost benefit even harder to crack. So everything I've talked about today, we've got it all on the Green Algorithm website. So feel free to check it out if you're interested. And I need to finish by acknowledging quite a lot of people who've worked on all the different bits of this presentation. As you say, it takes a village, but amazing work across Europe on that kind of work. And we should have some time for some discussions. Cool. So first question, great to see more info on the Green DiSC initiative. What sort of training materials do you think we need to bring to the community? And how do we loop that into university teaching? That's a really good question. So just quickly on Green DiSC, if you're interested in that, I've kind of recorded a full webinar style thing where I work through the details in much more details, and the recording of that is linked on the webpage, so you can check that out. That's really interesting. One of the things I'm working on at the moment is exactly that, some kind of on-demand introductory course to green computing, because there's really a need for that. There's some of that out there, so hopefully that will come out, but we need more of that. What really people could bring, and people in this group could bring, is to make something specific to your field of research. So it's great to have general background about green computing, but a little bit like the work. So I mentioned Charlotte Ray and Nick Sauter from the University of Sussex in neuroscience, and they now, based on what they learned about how to make neuroscience greener, they now have a roving workshop where they basically train up neuroscientists on how they could, very easily reduce the impact of their work. And so I think that's something we could really do there. So, with the field expertise you have and applying just generic information or generic knowledge, that's something that could be brought to the community. How to loop that into university teaching? My experience with it is usually it ends up being like kind of guest lecture or one-off session at the end of or during a course, and that works quite well. So I end up doing that quite often, either undergraduate or PhD courses. So PhD programs where they have some lectures, they will have some lectures around broader issues, research best practice and open data and so on. And I think I think we can do a lot of more of that. It should probably, I mean, in with the emergency crisis, the sustainability crisis, it really makes sense to have sustainability as kind of a standing orders in most curriculum. Again, it doesn't mean it should take over all the teaching, and it shouldn't be the most enormous part of it. But that's one of the use of the online calculator. Actually, I know it's been used quite a lot to do this kind of stuff, to deliver this kind of teaching, because it's an easy way to visualize the impact of compute without actually doing compute. Yeah, so hopefully that answered the question.
I had a thought, and I don't know if this was quite covered in some of the stuff. A lot of the times when we go, we have meetings and we have discussions, we get down and obviously into the debate in terms of actually how much data people need to keep, which obviously you talked about potentially not necessarily even needing to generate it in the first place, let alone keep it kind of once it's gone. But we get down into the sort of storing data and the cost potentially of storing data versus reproducing the data on demand. Is that something that the calculators start to consider, or is that not currently covered?
It's not part of the calculator per se, because it really focuses on computing and computations and running the computation. But that's an interesting question. I wouldn't say we want to reproduce data on demand. But for a project, you generate raw data, and it almost always makes sense to store the raw data, because it's either very complicated experimental work, or you sent a satellite somewhere, or you did a very long wet lab experiment in biology. And the carbon footprint would be much bigger to redo the experiment, so it makes sense to store raw data in the vast majority of cases. But then we've got all the intermediary data, things we produce and that we could actually recalculate using the analysis script. And we tend to store them forever. They never get deleted, and because then you want to keep them for publication, and that's fair. But then after that, people leave and no one knows where the data is, and it just ends up dying on the server, and it never gets deleted. So I think that's where we can really do better, is to say, okay, this is the data we need while the project is live. And this is the data that once the project is concluded, we should keep if someone wants to reanalyze them in the future, but actually all the intermediary files can be deleted. And there's probably a lot of scope around that. Now that your green algorithms calculator is being used for reporting, there may be an incentive for users to manipulate inputs to minimize their reported emissions. Yes. Do you see this as a potential issue? And if so, how do you address it? Yes, that's a good point. I mean, any metric, people will tend to cheat it. Around compute, so when it was used, for example, the example with the French government, where it was part of grant applications, it has, I mean, obviously you can cheat it, but it has some kind of inbuilt control mechanism. And that is that scientists will ask for funding for compute. They will say, as part of my grant, I need that many £1,000 to pay for 20,000 GPU hours on our university cluster, right? So here they have two choices. Either they put 20,000 GPU hours in the calculator, and they both get the budget but have to own up to the emissions, or they don't, or they only put 10,000 hours in the calculator, so they have fewer, like a third of the emissions, but at the same time they only get a third of the budget. And so it doesn't always work, but I quite like this self-built mechanism that at the end of the day, if you want the funding for it, you also have to own up to the emissions. I'm not sure. I'm sure people will find loopholes whenever possible, and that will be a case of asking for transparency. But hopefully we can control that a bit. Other question: do you differentiate between different types of stored data on the server, on the disk, on DVD, offline hard drive, and tape? Yes, it does make a difference. So you got hot storage typically. So part of which is data you can access instantly. So hard drive, but it needs to be powered by electricity all the time. And then you've got cold storage, which a lot of data centers will do for backups, which is usually tape, which means that once it's stored, it just sits somewhere and doesn't need to be powered, but it takes a little bit of time to get access to. And yes, it makes a difference. When I was talking about the carbon footprint of storage, I was the 10 kilograms per terabyte. That was very much hard drive storage. And that's where we can get creative on that. We can use that more with a view of sustainability, where at the moment it's mostly used with a view of costs, like financial costs. It's just basically doing proper assessment of the environmental impact of that's what makes sense now. Next question, how do we discuss deleting data with the public? Science has in the past been blamed for cherry picking data. How do we move past this? That's a very good question. And that's why I'm not advocating for deleting raw data at all, because I agree there's real value in having raw data. They're usually really hard to obtain anyway. I think if we just delete everything else, we're going to go a long way. You know, the kind of like intermediary files that, you know, 5 years after your publication, no one will ever look at them again, because first, no one will understand what they represent, no one will understand what's happened, and anyone who wants to replicate your data will have to replicate it from raw results anyway. So I considering the kind of cost of storage, I completely support the idea of saying let's store all the raw data and make sure everything keeps being reproducible, but dealing everything else. And hopefully that can address this idea of, you know, deleting data. Then you don't really need to discuss it with the public quite so much, because you're not actually deleting raw data, you're just deleting files that people didn't even know existed.
I have a little bit of a, I don't know, maybe a tricky question potentially, but like if you had to make kind of maybe 1 or 2 suggestions for somebody to maybe like improve their kind of awareness of like the sort of sustainability and stuff of like compute and data, like what would your kind of, you know, first suggestion be for them to kind of do?
Have a look on like online on papers like Google Scholar, stuff like that. See if someone has done it in your field. So you know, if someone was a neuroscientist, they could go up and find a couple of papers who had looked at neuroscience. I know there are papers in physics, in particle physics. There's the HECAP Plus group. So there are lots of like field specific groups that try to like facilitate knowledge around that. So that would be the place to start. Obviously, if you want a more general background, you're welcome to look at some of the papers we put out in my group and I mentioned today. They're kind of more broad background, although we did a bit of a dive in bioinformatics. But otherwise, I'd say just look at, does something exist in your field? Because that would be an interesting way to look at, you know, particular tools you're using every day. And if not, or even if so, a next step could be, okay, well, what's the carbon footprint of what I'm doing all the time? And, you know, people here are the best experts in their aspect of research. What are the standard pre-processing pipeline? What is the standard analysis pipeline? What are the software everyone uses in the field? And for those, you've got the data to put them into the calculator, right? And that could be really interesting, because then you can basically put out, it doesn't have to be an academic paper if you don't want to, but if you want it to be, go ahead. That can just be like a very quick survey of your field and say, FYI, these are the big orders of magnitude. Maybe we should think about that. And I think that's an interesting, first step.
Excellent. Yeah, there's definitely kind of a lot of different angles to think about in terms of the different areas, obviously very complex in terms of some of the stuff, but obviously a lot of it's about just, you know, getting people thinking about it, getting people talking about it, really actually looking at it and saying, oh, you know, do we need to be doing X, Y, Z? How can we make that like more efficient, but obviously not have the rebound effect. So there's lots of obviously really great kind of information in the presentation, and lots of links and resources. So we will make those available afterwards, so that people can obviously go back and find those and kind of find those out for themselves. I am just going to very quickly share my screen. So obviously this is just one in a series of webinars, and so we do have more events and webinars in the future. I think we are just about to publish the information on our next webinar, which hopefully will happen next month, but we've also got a couple of workshops also coming up soon, so you can always find out more about those on our events page. A lot of stuff around kind of data stewardship discussions and kind of pathways for that, and we are also ramping up for delivery of new services, which are going to be available in the spring. So if you want to find out more about that, do make sure that you are following us on social media. We are on most of the social media platforms, and you can also join our DiSC mail list, where lots of exciting information will be coming out about that soon. And if you'd like to find more webinars about what we've kind of been doing, you can go on to our YouTube channel, which is where this webinar will be published once the recording is edited, and there are lots of recordings from previous webinars there as well. So I just want to say a massive thank you to Alok for coming today and giving a really interesting presentation. Thank you to everybody for coming and asking questions, and I hope you've all had a really interesting time here, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day.